Before we begin, I thought it would be fun if everyone lets me know in the comments where they're watching this video from. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's start today's episode. Carla Walker. In 1974, 17-year-old Carla Walker was a junior at Western Hills High School in Fort Worth, Texas. Standing just 4 feet 11, she had long honey blonde hair that cascaded past her shoulders. She was in a relationship with Rodney McCoy, a wiry, good-natured young man who played quarterback for the school's football team. The couple often talked about their future, hoping to attend Texas Tech University together. Carla confided in her closest friends that she was certain she and Rodney would one day marry and build a life together. On the evening of February 16, 1974, Rodney arrived at the Walker home in Benbrook, a neighborhood in far west Fort Worth, to take Carla to the school's Valentine's Day dance. After the dance ended around 11:30 p.m., Rodney invited another couple to join him and Carla for a drive along Camp Bowie Boulevard and the Benbrook traffic circle. They made stops at a few popular teen hangouts, including Mr. Quick Hamburgers and Taco Bell. After dropping off their friends, Rodney and Carla drove to Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, a nearby bowling alley, where Carla stepped inside to use the restroom. Shortly after she got back into the car, the passenger door suddenly swung open. Rodney caught a brief glimpse of a tall man with short brown hair before the stranger began striking him over the head with the butt of a pistol. At some point during the assault, the gun's magazine clip became dislodged and fell onto the pavement. The attacker then grabbed Carla. As Rodney, barely conscious, struggled to process what was happening, he heard the man say, "You're coming with me, aren't you, sweetie?" Carla, in a desperate plea, told Rodney, "Go get my dad. Rodney, go get my dad." By the time Rodney regained full awareness, he was in the driver's seat, and it was around 1 a.m. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. Rodney sped toward the Walker home, located less than a mile away. In his panic, he drove over the curb and onto the front lawn before slamming on the brakes. Inside, Carla's parents, Leighton and Doris, were still awake, playing dominoes in the dining room with relatives. Her 12-year-old brother, Jim, and 18-year-old sister, Cindy, were in the living room watching television when they heard frantic banging at the front door. They were shocked to see Rodney standing there, blood streaming down his face. In a desperate panic, he shouted, "Mr. Walker, they've got her! They're gonna hurt her bad!" Leighton, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, immediately grabbed his pistol and rushed out toward the bowling alley. Meanwhile, Doris picked up the family's rotary phone, dialing the operator and asking to be connected to the police. As officers searched the parking lot, they discovered Carla's purse along with the magazine clip that had fallen from the attacker's gun. Meanwhile, other officers patrolled the surrounding streets in squad cars, scanning for any trace of Carla. After sunrise, more resources were deployed in the search, including officers using binoculars and helicopters circling the city. When classes resumed on Monday morning, detectives visited Western Hills High School. They examined contact sheets from the dance, looking for anyone who seemed out of place. Students were stopped in the hallways and questioned about whether they knew anyone who might want to harm Carla. Then, on February 20th, 1974, 4 days after Carla vanished, 2 officers assigned to the case were driving along a remote, 2-lane road near Benbrook Lake, about 5 miles southwest of the bowling alley. They pulled over near a culvert and a concrete drainage tunnel designed to allow water to pass beneath the road. Peering inside, they spotted a young woman lying on her back. Carla's face and neck were covered in scratches and deep bruises. It appeared she had been strangled, but with no ligature marks on her neck, investigators concluded that the killer had used his hands. The discovery of her body dominated the front page of the Star-Telegram, sending shockwaves through the community. Her funeral was held at the Western Hills Church of Christ, drawing more than 1,250 mourners, far exceeding the church's capacity. In response to the brutal crime, Fort Worth officials assembled a task force made up of detectives from various local police departments. However, investigators had little evidence to go on. No fingerprints were found on Carla's body or clothing, and the only blood present on her dress came from Rodney's head injuries. Traces of bodily fluid were recovered, but with DNA identification technology still in its infancy, they provided no leads. At the time, there were no surveillance cameras in parking lots or license plate readers on highways to aid in the investigation. In an effort to generate leads, authorities established a 24-hour tip line. At the downtown police headquarters, officers sat behind metal desks, sipping lukewarm coffee as they took calls from citizens offering names of potential suspects. Tips flooded in, with callers suggesting that Carla's killer was everything from a pair of marijuana dealers to a carnival worker from the Fort Worth stock show and rodeo, or even a quiet young man who often bowled alone at the alley where she had been abducted. Detectives also investigated reports of an argument between Carla and Rodney at Mr. Quick Hamburger's the night before the dance. In an attempt to jog Rodney's memory, investigators enlisted the help of a hypnotist. While under hypnosis, the most crucial detail Rodney recalled was that Carla's attacker had been wearing a brown or tan cowboy hat. When the hypnotist snapped his fingers, bringing Rodney back to full awareness, he broke down in tears. Rodney was devastated, haunted by the fact that he hadn't been able to save Carla. Meanwhile, during a task force meeting, detectives discussed another unsolved case, one that had occurred nearly a year earlier, on February 7, 1973. That night, a young woman named Becky Martin never made it home after attending a night class at Tarrant County Junior College's South Campus. Her body was discovered nearly 7 weeks later, so decomposed that the cause of death couldn't be determined. The medical examiner suggested Becky might have been stabbed, strangled, or even shot through the stomach. However, what truly caught investigators' attention was the location where her body was found, a culvert just outside the city limits. 2 young women, both found in culverts, exactly a year apart. The similarity felt like more than just coincidence. Though they kept their suspicions quiet, detectives began considering the possibility of a serial offender. By March, a month after Carla's murder, the task force had only one promising lead. Investigators determined that the magazine clip found in the bowling alley parking lot belonged to a newer Model .22 Ruger handgun. Seeking further information, they enlisted the help of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, requesting a list of Fort Worth residents who had purchased that specific model. The ATF compiled a list of a couple dozen names, and detectives set out to interview each one. Among those on the list was 31-year-old truck driver Glenn McCurley. He had grown up in West Texas as the eldest of 3 boys, but during his teenage years, his parents sent him to Westview Boys' Home in southwestern Oklahoma. Sponsored by the Churches of Christ, Westview advertised itself as a refuge for boys facing family difficulties, neglect, or minor legal troubles, those in need of guidance rather than detention. However, McCurley's time there didn't seem to have a lasting impact. By February 1961, he had left Westview and was living in Abilene, Texas, where he was caught stealing a car. After abandoning that stolen car, McCurley took another, triggering a pursuit by the State Highway Patrol. Officers eventually shot out one of his tires, forcing him to drive onto a vacant lot before attempting to flee on foot. However, he was quickly apprehended. In court, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He was released early in the spring of 1962 at the age of 19. McCurley later relocated to Midland, where he met a blonde high school student named Judy Watson. On February 16, 1963, they were married in a Baptist church and moved into a modest rental home. McCurley eventually secured a job as a truck driver for the U.S. Postal Service, running a route between Dallas and Fort Worth. Meanwhile, Judy gave birth to their 2 sons, Craig and Roddy. In 1972, McCurley relocated his young family to a neighborhood in West Fort Worth. He and Judy enrolled their sons in the local public elementary school and became members of Ridgely West Baptist Church. McCurley found work as a truck driver, transporting prefabricated concrete slabs to construction sites, while Judy took a job at the church's daycare center. However, one acquaintance noted a troubling habit. McCurley would often make inappropriate remarks when noticing an attractive woman, saying things like, "Take a look at that." In early March 1974, 2 detectives arrived at McCurley's home to question him about his .22 Ruger pistol. When asked about the weapon, he claimed it had been stolen from his pickup truck 6 weeks earlier while he was out fishing. He then agreed to take a polygraph test at the police station, which he passed. As a result, the task force quickly dismissed him as a suspect. By late spring of 1974, investigators still had little to show for their work. The task force didn't officially disband, but many of the detectives were ordered by their supervisors to return to their other cases. Strangers would occasionally call the Walkers' house, many of them anonymously, claiming they had information about who ended Carla's life. Layton talked to all of them. He took notes and kept them in a metal box the size of a cigar box. He wrote down names and addresses of potential suspects, and he drew circles on maps where he had been told the culprit lived. He was not going to rest until he knew the man responsible was behind bars. When Carla's younger brother, Jim, turned 16 and got his driver's license, he began spending his free time helping his dad hunt for the perpetrator. Sometimes on the anniversary, he would prowl the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridgely Bull looking for anyone suspicious. Jim took boxing lessons at the Panther Boys Club, joined the high school's wrestling and football teams, and went on long runs through his neighborhood. "I wanted to be ready in case I ever came across the culprit," Jim said. "My plan was to overpower him and take him someplace far away. Maybe somewhere out in West Texas where no one can hear him scream." On February 19th of 1977, almost precisely 3 years after Carla's body was found, someone came across the body of 25-year-old June Ward, a vocational nurse lying next to a curb in South Fort Worth. June was naked except for a bra strap wrapped around her neck. She'd been strangled and beaten over the head with what the one reporter described as a sharp, heavy object. Detectives who had worked on the Carla Walker task force couldn't help but notice the similarities between the 2 crimes. Then, on July 9th of 1980, the body of a 19-year-old woman named Denise Hogue, described in the newspaper as an unemployed drifter, was found a few feet from a creek bridge in South Fort Worth. She too had been strangled. 2.5 years later, in February of 1983, the body of Christy Tower, a waitress at the family Billy Bob's Texas nightclub in the Stockyards, was discovered in a field north of the city. Her hands were bound with electrical wire and another wire was twisted around her neck. Like the other crimes, Christy's case remained a mystery. Though, a few days after her body was found, detectives received a curious bit of news. They learned that Christy's purse had been found in a dumpster behind Cheers, a bar on Champ Bowie Boulevard. Cheers was only a half a mile from the Brunswick Ridgely bowling parking lot, the place where Carla had been kidnapped in February of 1974. Residents were getting more worried about the prospect of a serial offender. Such concerns grew when Catherine Davis, a 23-year-old aspiring model, went missing on September 9th of 1984. Her body was found in a field in far South Fort Worth. About a month later, on October 19th, Marilyn Hartman, a 25-year-old middle school teacher, was found gagged and strangled in her Fort Worth bedroom. Just 3 days after that, Cindy Heller, a 23-year-old Texas Christian University graduate and former beauty contestant, disappeared after last being seen near Hullen Mall. She was later found strangled in a creek bed on the Texas Christian University campus. The tragedies kept piling up. On November 26th of 1984, Katherine Jackson, another local middle school teacher, was found naked in her bathtub with the water still running. She had been strangled with a cord. 2 weeks after that, Angela Ewart, a 21-year-old part-time model and programmer for an FM rock station, left her fiancé's house in southwest Fort Worth. The following day, her car was found abandoned by a highway in a southern part of the city, and her decomposed remains were eventually discovered in a field north of Fort Worth. On the evening of December 22nd, just days before Christmas, 21-year-old Regina Grover was seen with her boyfriend walking out of the Keg, a restaurant on Camp Bowie. She was found the next day, strangled and drowned in a creek under a bridge in North Fort Worth. Her boyfriend, who was found in his bed at his apartment, had been fatally bludgeoned. Fort Worth women, especially those living in the southwestern part of the city, were panicking. Local media reported on skyrocketing gun and mace sales. When the police department offered a free seminar on self-defense, more than 3,000 attended, most of them women. The police department formed another task force. "We're going to break this thing," Police Chief H.F. Hopkins promised. Detectives questioned every suspect from ex-cons with long rap sheets to a freelance photographer. The investigation, though, was fruitless. The only welcome news was a lull in crimes. The culprit, if it was one culprit, seemed to have retreated. That was until February 24th of 1986. A passerby came across a woman's unclothed body, partially wrapped in a blanket lying on a hillside near a park in central Fort Worth. She had been strangled, but the police could not identify her through the usual means, fingerprints or dental records, nor did they receive any reports about a missing woman that might have provided a clue. Another year passed, and then another. And this time, it really did appear as if the unknown man committing all these crimes had retreated for good. Carla Walker's little brother, Jim, had not given up. After graduating from Western Hills High, Jim had attended Sam Houston State University, where he read books on serial offenders and took courses in abnormal psychology so that he could better understand what he described as the criminal mind. After he graduated from college, he moved back to Fort Worth and applied to become an officer with the city's police department. His plan was to get promoted to detective and get his hands on Carla's files and find the man responsible. During a training session at the academy's firing range, however, Jim noticed something was wrong with his eyesight. A doctor later diagnosed him with a congenital eye condition. Forced to drop out of the academy, he went to work in security at a local office of defense contractor General Dynamics. But he continued hunting for the man responsible. After his father passed away in 1987 of a heart attack, Jim dug through the notes in Layton's metal box looking for new leads to pursue. After his mother passed away in February 2015, Jim purchased his parents' home and moved into it with his wife. "I wanted to be there in case somebody ever got a conscience at 3 in the morning and showed up to confess," he said. In February, detectives Leah Wagner and Officer Jeff Bennett decided to take another look at Carla's case after Jim made a request. Among those they re-interviewed was Carla's then-boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, who had moved to Alaska as soon as he graduated from high school to work on an oil rig, telling his family that he needed to get as far away from Fort Worth as possible. He eventually returned to Texas and was living near Austin when Wagner and Bennett reached him. To try to locate new witnesses, investigators posted a message on the police department's Facebook page. They got a couple dozen responses, including one from a woman who claimed that her ex-husband had grown up in the same neighborhood as Carla and had kept a stash of newspaper articles about her case, which he occasionally reread. A likely sign, said the ex-wife, that he was responsible. No doubt to the ex-wife's disappointment, the ex-husband was able to prove he'd been out of town the weekend Carla's life was taken. What the detectives needed was physical evidence, and the best physical evidence they could hope to find, of course, was the culprit's DNA. Since Carla lost her life, the technology of DNA identification had not only been developed, but had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. There were now even laboratories that specialized in genealogical mapping, in which technicians use freely accessible databases to link DNA from an unknown person to the DNA of that person's relatives. Fortunately for Wagner and Bennett, Carla's dress and other clothing she'd worn the night her life was ended had been carefully packed away in paper bags in the police department's evidence lab, which meant there was a chance that technicians still could turn up a usable sample of DNA. After all these years, however, there was no way of knowing whether the DNA had degraded, which would prevent the technicians from compiling a full genetic profile of the man responsible. Once more, conducting DNA tests on Carla's clothes could cost the Fort Worth Police Department as much as $20,000, money that was more likely to go towards active cases. Wagner and Bennett were determined to find at least one good lead, but they knew the odds were against them. Then, their investigation took an unpredictable turn. Vincent Strange was a 40-year-old Fort Worth aerospace technician and true crime buff. In 2017, he created a podcast about unsolved cases in Texas. His first story was going to be about Carla Walker, whose case he had read about while poking around the internet. He interviewed Carla's siblings, Jim and Cindy, as well as a few of her friends. One person who did listen to it was Diane Kuykendall. Diane had gone to school with Carla. Carla always smiled at her in the hallway even though they didn't really know each other. Diane said it made her feel good and that she wishes that there was some way that she could pay Carla back. Diane decided to fly pamphlets to the likes of Dateline's Keith Morrison, Fox out the pamphlets to the likes of Dateline's Keith Morrison, Fox News' Nancy Grace, and Paul Holtz, a retired investigator who works for the Oxygen Network. Paul Holtz was intrigued and convinced Oxygen to pay $18,000 to cover the cost of DNA testing on Carla's clothes. At a lab in California, technicians found some intact, untainted bodily fluid were found. From that fluid, they were able to develop a full DNA profile, which they uploaded to CODIS, a nationwide law enforcement database that contains the DNA of millions of criminal offenders. CODIS, however, couldn't find a match. Paul Holtz and his producers contacted a Texas lab that also does genealogical mapping, but technicians there had no luck either. David Middleman, CEO of Othram, then got into contact with Paul Holtz. He said he was optimistic that his particular DNA identification method, a sophisticated technology that used genome sequencing, could find a match. The morning of July 4th of 2020, David Middleman called Officer Bennett. "We've connected the DNA to a particular family tree," he said. "The last name is McCurley." After some further testing and police work, Middleman and Bennett landed on Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., who had been living in Fort Worth at the time of Carla's demise. Bennett saw Glenn McCurley Jr. was the truck driver who had told the police back in 1974 that his Ruger 22 had been stolen. Wagner and Bennett did a background check on McCurley, but there was little to learn. As far as they could tell, other than his 1961 criminal conviction for stealing a car when he was 18, he had no encounters with the police. McCurley was no longer driving trucks full-time by then. He took on handyman jobs and did part-time maintenance work at a fitness club. Wagner and Bennett decided to pay him a visit. They arrived unannounced at the McCurley's home. McCurley and his wife, Judy, politely invited the detectives into the living room and chatted amiably. McCurley talked about his old truck driving gigs. Judy said she had spent 32 years at Ridgely West Baptist Daycare Program, finally retiring in February 2004 because of health issues. She also mentioned that her husband suffered from diabetes and that he'd recently had surgery to remove a tumor the size of a quarter on his liver. "We're not ready for this," Judy said, "especially with his cancer." Finally, McCurley asked the detectives, his voice raspy, "What do y'all want to talk about?" "We're gonna take you way back," Wagner said. "Back in 1974, y'all were living here at the time, so you may have heard about it. There was a young lady kidnapped from a bowling alley." "I know exactly which one you're talking about," Judy immediately said. "Carla Walker." Judy later told detectives she could remember where the Walker family lived on Williams Road. "They kept her room the same way it was," she said. "They kept her car still parked in the driveway for years and years. You'd drive by and see that car parked in the driveway, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking." Detective Wagner said that she and Bennett had reopened the investigation and were contacting those who had been interviewed by police in 1974. "It's a huge case," she said. "And we saw at one point they had talked to you, Mr. McCurley." Wagner asked McCurley if she could take a DNA sample. "It would be the easiest way to eliminate him as a suspect," she explained. McCurley hesitated. Then he took a pen, signed a consent form, and opened his mouth so Wagner could dab the inside of his cheek with a Q-tip. Looking on, Judy told the detectives, "I hope you find out who is responsible. That girl needs to be remembered as someone who mattered." 11 days later, after lab techs verified that the DNA from McCurley's cheek perfectly matched the DNA found on Carla's bra strap, the members of the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force arrived at his house to arrest him. He was driven downtown to the police department, where he waived his right to have a lawyer present during his interrogation. For several minutes, he sat alone in an interview room. At first, he denied any involvement. He claimed he had never seen Carla Walker before. Finally, he said with tears swelling in his eyes, "Okay. I did do it, I guess." He told the detectives that on the afternoon of February 16th of 1974, he had drunk whiskey and beer for several hours. He said he began driving around and parked in some parking lots. At one point, he drove to the bowling ball place. It seemed as if McCurley was about to confess. Instead, he told the detectives he'd heard a girl screaming in a nearby car. "I went over there to see if I could help. This big guy had her up against the door jerking her around." McCurley said he opened the front passenger door and gotten into a tussle with the boy. He pushed him off Carla, led her back to his car, and then drove her to another parking lot. "She started hugging me, thanking me, and one thing led to another." He claimed that everything that happened between him and Carla was consensual, and he did not know what had happened to her after that. After speaking to his court-appointed attorneys, McCurley pleaded not guilty. His attorneys argued in their court filings that Othram Lab's DNA test was flawed and that Wagner and Bennett had coerced McCurley into a false confession. The attorneys also portrayed McCurley as feeble. "This man poses no threat to anyone. As far as I can tell, he has led an utterly uneventful life." 9 months later, on June 16th of 2021, the first pretrial hearing open to the public took place. Dressed in a green jail-issue jumpsuit, McCurley was wheeled into the courtroom. When the trial formally began a few months later, Carla's boyfriend, Rodney, took the stand to recount the harrowing night she disappeared. Retired Detective Jim Minter testified about the original investigation, while Wagner and Bennett detailed their own police work. Prosecutors Diavinian and Emily Dixon unfolded the powder blue dress Carla had worn the night she was taken, presenting it to the jury. They also played 3 hours of the videotaped interview in which Wagner and Bennett questioned McCurley following his arrest. Then came the prosecution's most damning revelation, a piece of evidence that had not been publicly known. The .22 Ruger McCurley had long claimed was stolen had actually been found during a search of his home, concealed in a hidden compartment above a door. With such overwhelming proof, the case was effectively closed. On the third day of the trial, McCurley changed his plea to guilty, and the judge swiftly sentenced him to life in prison. Even after the verdict, lingering questions remained. What could have driven Glenn McCurley, a man without a known history of violent crime, to commit such a brutal act? Was it a spur-of-the-moment decision fueled by alcohol, or had he been a hidden predator responsible for the deaths of other young women in Fort Worth? And if he had been a serial offender, what caused him to stop in the mid-1980s? Did he undergo a true change of heart, or was he simply better at avoiding detection? Was redemption even a possibility? Authorities suspect that McCurley may be linked to additional crimes, and investigations into his potential involvement remain ongoing. Moving on to the next case. Eva Thompson. Despite the warmth and success that surrounded them, tragedy struck on the night of November 15, 1991. When Anna returned home from an evening church service, she was met with a horrifying scene. Her husband, George, and her mother, Eva, had been brutally attacked in their own home. The crime scene painted a picture of extreme violence. George had suffered multiple stab wounds, while Eva, defenseless in her hospital bed, had been suffocated. The attack stunned the small town of Prunedale. With no witnesses and little physical evidence, investigators struggled to find leads. Over the years, the case grew cold, leaving Anna and the community to grieve without closure. However, recent advancements in forensic technology have breathed new life into the decades-old mystery. A breakthrough in DNA testing led authorities to a shocking suspect, Michael Reyes, a former employee at Smith's restaurant. Investigators allege that Reyes had a personal grievance with George and may have targeted the household out of anger or desperation. Now, with Reyes in custody, long-awaited justice may finally be within reach. For the town of Prunedale, The arrest reopens old wounds but also brings hope that the victims will no longer be forgotten and that the man responsible for their deaths will finally be held accountable. Though Eva faced physical limitations, she remained a cherished part of the household, offering a familiar and comforting presence in the Smiths' daily lives. However, on November 11, 1991, what began as an ordinary autumn day took a horrific turn for the Smith family and the tight-knit community of Prunedale. After spending the day running errands, Anna Smith returned home that evening, only to be confronted with an unthinkable scene. The family's residence, which also served as the heart of their well-loved restaurant, had become the site of a brutal crime. Inside, George Smith was found in his office, the victim of a vicious attack. The desk where he once handled business matters now bore the grim evidence of a ruthless assault. George had been seated when he was ambushed from behind. His life ended in a shocking act of violence. In another part of the home, Anna's 79-year-old mother, Eva Thompson, was discovered in her hospital-style bed. Unable to move and utterly defenseless, she had no way to protect herself from the assailant. The brutality she endured was just as horrific, and like George, she had been fatally stabbed. The crime scene seemed to have the hallmarks of a ruthless burglary gone awry. The screen of the house's door had been slashed, indicating forced entry. The brutality of the stabbings was evident, with both victims showing signs of defensive injuries, suggesting they had fought valiantly against their attacker. The initial investigation was chaotic, but methodical. Crime scene investigators worked meticulously to collect evidence from the home and restaurant. They combed through the premises, searching for anything that could shed light on the identity of the perpetrator. The slashed screen door, the brutalized bodies, and the disarray within the house were carefully examined. Forensic teams gathered physical evidence, including potential DNA samples, fingerprints, and any trace of the weapon used. Early on, attention turned to potential suspects. Given that the crime involved a burglary and was committed with a knife, investigators considered individuals with a motive and knowledge of the property. The sheriff's office faced the difficult task of piecing together a case with limited leads. They followed various avenues, including interviewing potential witnesses, analyzing financial records, and exploring rumors of buried treasure that had circulated among the townspeople, but to no avail. The investigative efforts were hindered by the lack of immediate forensic breakthroughs. The DNA technology of the early 1990s was not as advanced as it would become. An initial test did not yield conclusive results. As a result, the case remained open with suspects, but no arrest was made. Decades after the brutal slayings of George Smith and Eva Thompson, a breakthrough came with the advancement of DNA technology. In early 2024, an additional round of DNA testing on evidence collected from the crime scene yielded crucial results that had eluded investigators in the years prior. The re-evaluation of forensic evidence, made possible by improvements in DNA analysis techniques, provided the concrete evidence needed to charge Ira Ulysses Bastian with the crime. Bastian was a former employee who worked at Smith's restaurant about a year and a half before the crime. Bastian's tenure at the restaurant was marked by his reliability, but little did anyone know his connection to the Smiths would take a dark and violent turn. His past employment at the restaurant, combined with his familiarity with the Smiths, made him a prime suspect in 1991. Bastian was not apprehended due to a lack of evidence then. The renewed investigation focused on the DNA samples recovered from the crime scene, including traces found on the weapon and at the points of forced entry. The sophisticated testing, which went beyond the capabilities of early 1990s technology, allowed investigators to match the DNA to Bastian with a high degree of certainty. This advancement not only linked Bastian to the crime, but also helped confirm his involvement in the brutal acts committed against the Smiths. As the evidence mounted, so did the investigation into Bastian's potential motive. Among the theories was the speculation that the slayings were driven by a desire to find hidden treasure. Rumors had circulated in the Prunedale community that George Smith and his wife had buried valuable items, such as gold coins or rare currency on their property. This theory of buried treasure became a central element in the case's story, fueling speculation about why Bastian might have targeted the Smiths. Bastian's prior employment at Smith's restaurant gave him a unique insight into the layout of the property and the habits of its owners. Investigators explored whether this familiarity could have facilitated the crime and contributed to the motive. If Bastian was indeed aware of any rumors about hidden valuables, it would have provided him with a potential incentive to commit the crime. 85-year-old Ira Ulysses Bastian was arrested on July 15, 2024 and taken into custody without incident. Following his arrest, he was charged with 2 counts of first degree. During his arraignment on July 16, 2024, Bastian entered a plea of not guilty to the charges against him. His defense is expected to challenge the validity of the DNA evidence and scrutinize the alleged motive behind the crime. What had long been considered an unsolvable case due to a lack of leads was reignited by advancements in forensic science, ultimately allowing investigators to connect Ira Ulysses Bastian to the horrific murders. For the Smith and Thompson families, as well as the Prunedale community, the case serves as a haunting reminder of the devastating effects of violence, especially against the elderly and vulnerable. As the legal proceedings move forward, many hold on to the hope that justice will finally be served, bringing a sense of closure to a case defined by its shocking brutality. Moving on to the next case. Matt Flores. Matt Flores, a 26-year-old former military officer, had recently started a job at Applied Materials Incorporated in Silicon Valley. He lived with his wife of 4 years, Denise, and their newborn daughter, Danielle. On March 24, 1994, just 9 days into his training, Matt arrived at work and parked in the middle of the lot. Nearby, a fellow employee sat in her car, listening to a talk show on the radio. When a gunshot echoed through the lot, the woman stepped out to investigate. According to police, she quickly dialed 911 after realizing someone had been shot. Matt had been killed with a single gunshot to the back of the head at point-blank range. Investigators believe he never even saw his killer. Astonishingly, despite over 20 people being in the parking lot at the time, no one witnessed the shooting. Although security cameras were present, the attack occurred in a blind spot, just beyond their reach. Authorities found no evidence suggesting Matt had enemies or any reason to be targeted, leaving the case a baffling mystery. However, one of the cameras did give the police their most significant lead. The footage shows seconds later, a 2-door Ford Probe, similar to Matt's, was followed by the Ford Explorer. A few minutes later, the Explorer exited the parking lot. Then 3 minutes before the shooting, the Explorer re-entered the parking lot and went in the direction where the shooting occurred. At 8:12 a.m., 2 minutes before the shooting, Matt and the female eyewitnesses entered the parking lot. At 8:14 a.m., the murder takes place just out of the camera's range. Approximately 20 seconds later, the Ford Explorer leaves the parking lot, never to be seen again. Because the Explorer initially followed a car that looked like Matt's, police believe the murder may have been a case of mistaken identity and that the driver of the car was planning on killing the man in the same car type as Matt's. Police have looked into several theories, including that he was killed as a result of a road rage incident, that his death was related to the military, and another that his death was related to his job. They looked into the possibility that his murder was related to the death of Sergeant Nicholas Gange, who served under Matt while in the military. Gange disappeared under mysterious circumstances in April 1993 and was later discovered dead under suspicious conditions. Despite various theories, no concrete evidence has emerged to support them. The case remains open, and authorities continue to seek new leads. The most significant clue so far is a Ford Explorer captured on surveillance footage in the parking lot. The vehicle is a 2-door sport model produced between 1991 and 1994, featuring distinctive black trim along its lower panels. A $100,000 reward is being offered for information that could help solve the case. Moving on to the next case. Miranda Gaddis and Ashley Pond. Lori Pond and her 12-year-old daughter, Ashley, resided at the Newell Creek Village Apartments in Oregon City, Oregon. On the morning of January 9, 2002, Ashley was running late for school. It was just after 8 a.m., and the school bus was only minutes away. The walk up the hill to the bus stop was less than 10 minutes, yet Ashley never arrived at the bus stop or made it to school. Despite extensive searches conducted by local authorities and the FBI, no clues emerged regarding her disappearance. Ashley was a well-liked student, actively involved in both the swimming and dance teams. On that particular day, she had been excited about her dance practice after school. Neither her mother, friends, nor investigators believed she had run away. Then, just 2 months later, on March 8, 2002, another disappearance shook the community. Miranda Cotties, Ashley's close friend and a resident of the same apartment complex, also vanished at around 8 a.m. while on her way to the same bus stop at the top of the hill. Miranda's mom, Michelle Duffy, left for work at 7:30 a.m. At around 1:20 p.m., Miranda's older sister called their mom to tell her that Miranda had not been at school that day. Ms. Duffy called the school and found out that Miranda was indeed absent. She reported her missing and the FBI was again called in to investigate. But once again investigators came empty-handed. Authorities began to suspect that they were taken by someone that they knew. The circumstances surrounding Miranda's disappearance were eerily similar to that of Ashley's 2 months earlier. There was also a striking resemblance between the girls. Both had similar facial features, height, weight, both had brown eyes, and went up to the same hill to the same bus stop. Then, surprisingly, on August 13, 2002, Ward Weaver's son contacted 911 and reported that his father had attempted to rape his 19-year-old girlfriend. He also told the dispatcher that his father told him that he murdered Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis. Both of the girls were friends with Weaver's 12-year-old daughter and had visited her at Weaver's home. These accusations allowed the police to search Ward Weaver's property. On the weekend of August, the bodies of Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis were found on the property of Ward Weaver's rental home. Ashley's remains were found inside a barrel buried beneath a concrete slab that had been poured shortly after her disappearance. Miranda's body was discovered in a box stored inside a shed on the same property. Autopsies later confirmed their identities. The man responsible, Ward Weaver, had a long history of violence and assaults against women. He was also the individual Ashley had accused of attempted rape, but her complaint was never investigated by authorities. On October 4, 2002, Weaver was indicted for the murders of Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis, along with additional charges in an unrelated case, including sexual abuse, attempted rape, aggravated murder, and abuse of a corpse. To avoid the death penalty, Weaver pleaded guilty to the murders of his daughter's friends. He was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. Moving on to the next case. Richard Horne. Writing, whether as a profession or a pastime, brings joy to many. It serves as an escape, a way to unleash creativity, or a means to convey messages to readers everywhere. While we recognize that books, even those telling chilling tales, are meant as exercises in imagination, we often admire the authors behind them. However, that doesn't mean every writer is free of dark secrets. Such is the case with Richard Horne. Born on May 9, 1960, in Coventry, Warwickshire, England, Richard Horne was the son of Derek and Josephine Horne. He spent much of his childhood on a farm before attending boarding school, later completing his education at Wrekin College in Shropshire. In 1978, he relocated to Edinburgh, where he adopted the pen name Harry Horse. Richard became a celebrated children's author, known for works like The Castaways, which won the Nestle Smarties Book Prize, and The Last Polar Bears, later adapted into a children's cartoon. His debut book, published in 1983, centered around the Loch Ness Monster. In addition to being a skilled writer and illustrator, Richard was also a musician, serving as the lead singer for the Scottish bluegrass band Swamp Trash, which was formed in Edinburgh in 1987. He later fronted another band called Hexology. In 1993, he designed, created, and wrote Drowned God, Conspiracy of the Ages, a point-and-click adventure game. During a 1989 Swamp Trash performance in Shetland, Richard crossed paths with Mandy Williamson, a fish packer and nursing auxiliary. Their romance was swift, leading to marriage in 1990, and they enjoyed a happy life together until Mandy was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. In 2004, the couple relocated to Shetland to be closer to Mandy's parents. However, behind Richard's successful career and the public persona he maintained, trouble was brewing. On January 10, 2007, Richard, 46, and Mandy, 39, were discovered dead in their home in Westboro, Shetland Islands. Initially, media outlets described their deaths as a final act of love. Mandy had been confined to a wheelchair for some time and struggled with speech difficulties. Islanders and mainstream media assumed that Richard and his wife had entered into a suicide pact. Mandy was terminally ill, and the children's author just couldn't live without her, so they decided to go out together. That was the narrative that was sold. The details of the deaths were kept from the public for over a year until Richard's mother eventually revealed the truth. Mandy had been stabbed by Richard over 30 times with such viciousness that the first blade handle had broken, so he used the second to finally take Mandy's life from her. She had defensive wounds all over her arms. Next, Richard killed the family pets, a cat and a dog, before he finally turned the blade on himself. He stabbed himself 47 times, collapsing on the bed next to his wife and bleeding out. Earlier that day, friends of the couple had visited them. Reportedly, Richard was in a, quote, demented state, saying, quote, "It's a wonderful night for a killing." Mandy, frightened by her husband's words and manner, didn't want their friends to leave, but they did for unknown reasons. When they returned the next morning at around 9:40 a.m. for a belonging they'd left behind, they found the gruesome bloodbath. Mandy's murder was the first in Shetland in over 15 years. The scene was so horrifying that the doctor who'd attended had to take time off work afterwards, traumatized by what he had seen. When the truth came out, Richard's true nature became clear to onlookers. In the months leading up to the horrific crime, Richard had withdrawn from friends and family, becoming increasingly volatile and prone to violent outbursts. As Mandy's illness worsened, so did his uncontrollable temper. He reportedly described Shetland as a living nightmare and confided in friends about the strain of tending to his wife's physical needs. Drug paraphernalia was discovered in their home, and while Richard was known to be a frequent marijuana user and occasional ecstasy taker, he had allegedly consumed a mix of substances on the night of the incident. However, the exact drugs he ingested remain unknown. Despite the brutality of the crime, Richard is still remembered fondly by fellow writers, and his deeply unsettling dark side has largely gone unnoticed online. Moving on to the next case. Shawn Ritchie. Shawn Ritchie was a 20-year-old from Fraserburgh, Scotland. On Halloween night in 2014, he attended a party in Greenburn, Scotland. He and 7 friends had traveled in a van to a secluded farmhouse in the countryside near Stricken. At some point during the night, an unknown incident occurred, prompting Shawn and his friends to flee the house in a panic. In the chaos, they split into 2 groups, each believing that Shawn was with the other. While his friends all made it home that night, Shawn never did. When he failed to return the following day, his family reported him missing. What followed was one of the largest search operations in Scotland's history. Authorities dedicated thousands of man-hours to scouring the area, bringing in soil experts, psychological profilers, search dogs, divers, and helicopters. The rough terrain, consisting of bogs, dense gorse bushes, ponds, and thick woodland, made the search incredibly challenging. The police had ground-penetrating radar, and they had found stuff in the bogs, tiny little artifacts and loads of animal bones, but no trace of Shawn. A few days later, some of Shawn's clothing and belongings were discovered close to the farmhouse in a boggy area, but that was the last evidence ever found. Nothing would ever turn up after that. Police would soon learn that on that day, 2 emergency calls were made to emergency services from the Greenburn area. One call was made requesting for help, and the second call was made canceling the requested help. No one knows who made the calls or why. Shawn's father, Charlie, believes that he was likely taken by someone and murdered. Charlie doesn't believe Shawn is alive. Even if he was not taken by someone, the temperature that night had dipped below 0 degrees Celsius, and with the minimal clothing he had on, he would not have survived the conditions. None of Shawn's friends have ever spoken publicly about what happened that day and remained quiet. Shawn's father revealed in a newspaper interview that he was aware the party had been attended by individuals of questionable character. However, the identities of these people and their connection to Shawn remain unclear. While police have not ruled out the possibility of foul play, they have found no concrete evidence indicating that Shawn was attacked or murdered. To this day, his disappearance remains an unsolved mystery. Moving on to the next case. Sherry Holtz. On that fateful December morning in 1999, Sanford law enforcement arrived at a grim crime scene, finding Sherry Holtz's body abandoned in the woods. The brutality of her injuries spoke volumes, but for years, the case remained a mystery. Investigators pursued leads, but without definitive evidence, justice seemed out of reach. Sherry had spent years in a turbulent relationship with Gary Durrance, a man with a known history of domestic violence. Their home, which they shared with 3 other roommates, often became a backdrop for volatile arguments. From 1996 to 1999, police were frequently called to intervene in their disputes, painting a picture of a relationship marked by escalating tension. For nearly 25 years, the question of who had taken Sherry's life loomed over the case, until advances in forensic science finally provided a breakthrough. A new DNA analysis led authorities back to someone who had been in plain sight all along. Witnesses recalled Sherry appearing distressed that night, though she tried to mask it with small talk and drinks. When she left the bar on the evening of December 3, 1999, no one could have predicted it would be the last time she was seen alive. With nowhere to go after being forced out of her home, she was vulnerable, alone, and unknowingly walking toward her tragic fate. 2 days later, her body was discovered in the woods, discarded, beaten, and left without dignity. The timing of her disappearance, coupled with her tumultuous relationship with Gary, immediately placed him under scrutiny. However, at the time, there was not enough physical evidence to charge him. For decades, the case remained unsolved, haunting investigators and Sherry's loved ones. But in recent years, with advancements in forensic science, a crucial breakthrough would finally emerge, one that would lead authorities straight to the person responsible for her brutal end. Her departure from the bar would be the last sighting of her before she was found lifeless in the woods of Sanford on December 4th. Sherry was found lying on a concrete slab about 20 feet into the woods, her body showing clear signs of a violent and brutal assault. The nature of her injuries, blunt force trauma to the head, strangulation, assault, and a slashed throat were horrific signs of a crime of extreme violence. Her body was positioned in a manner that suggested a deliberate attempt to hide her, and a bloody lock blade knife was found near her body. Although the knife was suspected to be a crucial piece of evidence, the technology available at the time was insufficient to analyze the DNA samples effectively. The blood on the knife, combined with the other DNA evidence collected, proved difficult to test due to the limitations of forensic technology in February. This would prove to be a significant hurdle in solving the case. Investigators also focused on Sherry's recent activities and relationships. This information brought Gary into the spotlight as a person of interest. Witnesses from the local bar where Sherry was last seen provided valuable information. They confirmed that she had left the bar on December 3rd, but their accounts could not place her at the scene of the crime. This left investigators with few leads and no clear suspects beyond Durrance, who denied any involvement in the crime. The investigation also included attempts to trace Sherry's final movements and to identify potential witnesses who might have seen or heard something relevant to the case. Despite these efforts, the lack of concrete evidence and the passage of time made the case go cold. In May 2023, the Sanford Police Department reopened the cold case, driven by the advances in forensic science. Modern DNA analysis methods, capable of handling smaller and more degraded samples, were employed to re-examine the preserved evidence. This reanalysis proved pivotal. The DNA from the knife's blade was confirmed to be Sherry's blood, while the handle of the knife contained DNA that matched Gary Durrance, Sherry's longtime boyfriend. This was a crucial breakthrough, as Gary had been a person of interest due to his tumultuous relationship with Sherry and their reported domestic disputes. The new DNA evidence was further supported by re-interviews with witnesses and statements made by Gary, which indicated he had knowledge of the crime scene before it was officially discovered. These statements, made before the crime's details were publicly known, reinforced the case against him. This technological breakthrough not only identified him, but also enabled authorities to obtain an arrest warrant on July 17, 2024. He was subsequently taken into custody the following day and charged with second-degree slaying. The resolution of Sherry Holt's case, after nearly 25 years, highlights the profound impact that advancements in forensic technology can have on cold cases. After nearly 25 years, the case that once seemed impossible to solve has finally reached a turning point. The arrest of Gary Durrance not only brings justice for Sherry Holtz, but also serves as a reminder that no case is ever truly forgotten. The persistence of detectives and the power of forensic advancements have given Sherry's loved ones the answers they desperately sought for decades. As Durrance awaits his court appearance on September 10, 2024, the Sanford community watches closely, hopeful that justice will finally be served. For Sherry's family, while no verdict can undo their pain, the long-overdue accountability marks the beginning of closure, a resolution they never thought they'd see in their lifetime. Moving on to the next case. Walker County Jane Doe. On the morning of November 1, 1980, at approximately 9:20 a.m., a trucker driving along Interstate 45 North discovered the unclothed body of a young woman lying near the roadside. She was located about 2 miles north of Huntsville and half a mile south of the FM 1696 exit. Based on the autopsy findings, she had died roughly 6 hours before being found. The attack had been vicious. She had been sexually assaulted with a blunt object, severely beaten, and ultimately strangled to death. Her body bore multiple bruises, and her right eyelid and lips were notably swollen. A bite mark was observed on her left shoulder, though no bodily fluids were detected during the examination. Several witnesses later reported seeing a girl resembling her the day before her body was discovered. One individual recalled spotting her at the South End Gulf Station around 6:30 p.m. on October 31st, where she was asking for directions to the Ellis Prison Unit. At the time, she had exited a blue Chevrolet Caprice from either 1973 or 1974 with a light-colored top, driven by a white male. Witnesses noted that she appeared disheveled, as if she had been traveling or had slept in her clothes. She had been wearing blue jeans and a yellow pullover sweater with large pockets, and she was carrying a pair of high-heeled sandals. She left the gas station on foot and walked north along Sam Houston Avenue, more than likely trying to hitchhike. That same girl was then later seen at the Hitchin Post truck stop alongside I-45, where she again requested directions to the Ellis Prison Unit, claiming a friend was waiting for her at this location. In response, a waitress drew a map providing directions to the prison farm, which she then handed to the girl. The waitress asked where she was from, and she informed her that she was from either Arkansas Pass or the Rockport area. When she was questioned about her age, she claimed to be 19 years old. The waitress asked if her parents knew where she was, to which the girl replied, "Who cares?" Both sightings have not been confirmed. The Ellis Prison Unit was 14 miles away from where the body was found. The police passed around a photo of the girl to the inmates and employees at the Ellis Prison Unit. However, no one was able to identify her. Police also asked law enforcement and people around Rockport and Arnestall Pass, but with no luck. There was speculation that Henry Lee Lucas was responsible for her murder. However, investigators were unable to make a match between the bite mark on her left shoulder and his dental reconstruction. On January 16, 1981, Walker County Jane Doe was buried in the Attic Keys addition at Oakwood Cemetery. She is buried beneath a tombstone donated by Morris Memorials. In 1999, her remains were exhumed in order to conduct further forensic examination of her remains, including obtaining a DNA sample from her body. In November of 2015, the case was officially reopened by the Walker County Sheriff's Office. The Walker County Jane Doe is described as being a white female and is believed to be between 14 and 18 years old. She was between the height of 5 foot to 5 foot 6 inches and weighed around 105 to 120 pounds. She had hazel eyes with light brown hair that was approximately 10 inches long. Her ears were pierced but did not have earrings in them. The girl had a 1.5-inch scar across the end of her right eyebrow. When her body was found, her toenails were painted pink and her fingernails weren't painted at all. The only thing she was wearing was a rectangular-shaped pendant with a smoky blue glass stone on a thin gold chain around her neck. The necklace was never photographed and has since been lost. No clothing was recovered from the scene, but a pair of red leather sandals was found nearby. In December 2015, a brother and sister came forward with a photograph from the 1980s of a white female, estimated to be around 14 years old and approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall. Her physical characteristics closely resembled those of Walker County Jane Doe. The siblings recalled meeting this girl at a motel in Beeville, Texas, during the summer of 1980. They believed she may have been living with a couple at the time, and remembered her expressing a desire to visit a friend at Sugar Land Prison. She introduced herself as Kathleen, possibly spelled with a C or a K, and claimed to be a runaway from Corpus Christi. However, it remains uncertain whether she has any connection to the Walker County Jane Doe case. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.